Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house. Today's video is inspired by a trip I made yesterday into town. I don't go into the city centre a lot because it's full of normies. Which is a lie. No one's really normal. It's just, there's lots of people there and I don't like big crowds. But I took the opportunity to pop into the big Waterstones bookshop we have in the city centre because I thought I'd have a poke around and see what was in the horror section. And to my shock and irony of ironies, to my horror, there is no horror section anymore. Now I know that the decline of the horror section in British bookstores has been slow and lingering. I mean, the horror sections have been on palliative care for a long time, and maybe this is something that happened a long time ago and I just didn't notice, but no horror section whatsoever is the absolute nadir of this scenario that I've seen withering on the vine for years, if not decades. I googled just before I started this video where have the horror sections gone in bookstores, and it took me to an article which pointed towards something that is said in the foreword of Paperbacks from Hell, which I myself don't have, but I know an awful lot of my booktuber friends have, and I've seen it quite a lot on my Twitter feed as well. And in the foreword to that, the editor of Paperbacks from Hell, rightly or wrongly, pinpoints the Oscar success of Silence of the Lambs as a turning point where creators, publishers were persuaded to sort of file the horror off the spines and the genre and reinsert it with thriller. Weirdly enough, that took me in a sort of Proustian rush back to, not quite Proustian because I wasn't smelling the article online, but it did take me back to Silence of the Lambs' success at the Oscars in 91, and how chagrined I was at that time that no one was saying it was a horror movie. It's a big win for horror at the Oscars. What should have been a real boost to the genre turned out to be a way for those in charge, who have always been shiftily ashamed of producing horror output, to perhaps, if this editor is right, spinning their tales as thrillers or dark thrillers rather than horror movies. Now there will be some who say, whoa, Andrew, play fair. The Silence of the Lambs is a thriller. It's not a horror. It's not a horror novel. It's a thriller novel, and it's not a horror movie. It's a thriller movie. Yeah, all right. I've got some sympathy for that stance. Although for me, horror is a really broad church which bleeds into an awful lot of other genres, and I think that the thriller is really side by side, and in certain times in lockstep with the horror genre. But if this editor was right, then the Silence of the Lambs' success was used as an excuse to try and, I guess over the decades, gentrify horror. And those who were squeamish with the notion of being labelled as horror could call themselves thriller writers or chiller writers. We'll get onto it in my series looking at the books of James Herbert. And James Herbert never shied away from calling himself a horror writer, but over his career he moved from publisher to publisher, and there was a time when he started being marketed as Britain's #1 chiller writer. Chiller. I write chillers. I'm a chiller. I'm a chiller writer. And he had no qualms about saying he was a horror writer, but I'm sure the people who do the focus groups and whatnot suggested that horror turned some people off, as it fucking should. It's fucking horror. But to have now a situation where there is no horror section, and don't get me wrong, it's not as if the horror sections in bookshops were in rude health. They absolutely were not. over the years, they've been shrinking to the point where you would be lucky now if in a modestly sized bookstore you had one shelf dedicated to horror. And for the longest time now, that would be mostly, they might as well have called it the Stephen King section rather than the horror section, but you would get King. You might get in a British bookstore some James Herbert novels, a Clive Barker if you were lucky. You might get a copy of Shirley Jackson's The House on Haunted Hill. You would get a collection of Poe, a collection of Lovecraft. And that would be pretty much about it. Yesterday when I went into Waterstones, and as I say, it's a city centre Waterstones, it's a big bookshop, it's over 2 levels, it's got escalators inside to take you up and down. I went to where it normally was and it wasn't there. There was a large sci-fi and fantasy section, and then there's the children's section, and then there's YA down there. And I walked all around downstairs and then all around upstairs, and then I went back to the sci-fi and fantasy section just to see whether anything jumped out. And there's old Stephen King over there in the sci-fi and fantasy. Here's one copy of the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe here in sci-fi and fantasy. Are there any? Is there any Clive Barker at all who out of all of the ones you might perhaps find in a dedicated horror section is probably the most closely aligned to fitting in a sci-fi and fantasy section, as well as his work matured and he sort of branched off more into the Aberrat books and Imagica and things like that. No Clive Barker, no new names. The newest name that I saw there was Joe Hill. And I've not read any Joe Hill. By all accounts, his books are pretty damn good. There are a lot of people like them. But if there is historically been such small representation in a dedicated horror section to the point where 75% of it is taken up by Stephen King, and you'd get Nosferatu there next to it, H next to K. How fucking convenient. I'm not saying he doesn't necessarily deserve his place there, but if you're really cherry picking what slim section of horror fiction you will deign to now put in your sci-fi and fantasy, I'm saying you're just lucky your dad is Stephen King, my friend, because there are so many writers out there and new voices we just don't hear about. They just won't even get a chance. They won't even get an inch, a half inch of book space that he's got. This is not a rant against Joe Hill. More power to you. Unless you start calling yourself a chiller or a thriller writer. Some of these folks up on these shelves who are living. So that's 2 of them, really, Joe Hill and Stephen King. I don't know whether it's the job of authors to start banging the drum and waving the flag for horror again. I don't know what the answer is. I guess it's cyclical. Almost said cynical, and it certainly is fucking cynical on the part of the publishing houses and Hollywood especially to always snub horror as sort of the unwanted guest at the table, the uninvited guest at the table, and turn their noses up at horror when from the 1930s onwards, we're almost a century, for almost 100 years in Western cinema, horror has reliably and consistently given the ability to make low-budget, high-return movies that please crowds and draw in punters. What more? Oftentimes horror will be the engine, the little backup generator that keeps Hollywood ticking over, that keeps these studios ticking over. Blumhouse knows this. low budget, high reward projects. A24 knows it, although not all of their projects are necessarily outright horror. They are certainly leaning on the horror mantle at a time. It's leaning on the post of horror in their marketing at a time when almost everyone else is shying away from it. I happen to love an awful lot of A24's output. Got no beef with them whatsoever. It really saddened me to see that there's not even now the sop, the scrap from the table thrown to the dogs sitting on the floor waiting for just a leg bone, a wing, please, anything, master. Not even the sop of here's one bookshelf for horror. It's mostly Stephen King that you've probably mostly read. I mean, they can't be saving money on the letters, because you double up on the O and triple up on the R, and you use one H, because I assume the more letters you have to use for the sign, the more expensive the sign is. Maybe that's why sci-fi instead of science fiction. And the crazy thing is that there's a lot of new horror out there. There's a lot of new horror fiction out there, but it's all indie press, or it's all authors self-publishing. So that's where I'm going now. I'm in the middle of reading Code Red by Regina St. Clair, which is her latest novel. It's a vampire novel that I am thoroughly enjoying. I'm dipping in and out at the moment of Slices of Paradise from Dark Lit Press, which is a vacation-themed horror anthology that I submitted to I wasn't successful for, but I wanted to see. I liked the idea of the theme, and I wanted to see what they were after, so I'm enjoying that. Recently, I've read from Ghost Orchid Press, Palimpsest by Caitlin Moreau, a single author horror anthology, and that's where I'm going to be getting my horror fiction from now, whilst rereading doing my big James Herbert read along. But horror seems to be bubbling underground again. It's the indie presses, and it's the solo self-publishing authors. Stephen King himself hasn't written a straight-out horror novel for I don't know how long, as far as I can tell. Not that I necessarily think that the world is crying out for yet another Stephen King horror novel. I just think that some of these new and exciting voices could be championed a little bit more. I think it's a very sorry and sad state of affairs. I understand from Regina's videos that it's horror sections in bookstores in the US is in slightly ruder health, which is good news. But over here it's dead. There's nothing. From what I can tell, it's gone. Put a rose on its grave. It got buried a long time ago, and I didn't even notice. Maybe part of that is the rise of online purchasing, and so brick and mortar bookshops have to cater to the widest possible demographic to try and get people in, to try and turn a profit so that they can carry on trading. And I get that, I understand that, especially after with the rise, in the wake of the rise of Amazon and the like, and online retailers. It's hard to run a bricks and mortar bookshop, I would imagine. But it all seems so short-sighted. It seems to underestimate the passion and the dedication that lifelong horror fans have. Because if you're a horror fan for life, more or less. I don't often hear, I used to love horror movies when I was a kid, but I've kind of grown out of them now. I'm more into historical romance now. That's my bag. Yeah, I used to love things like Friday the 13th and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but now I'm totally into Bavarian nose flute epics. Yeah, they're just so much more enriching and fulfilling. That's not to say that horror fans are one note. They love all kinds of other stuff, but, you know, we're like a stick of rock. If you cut me, I'm, say, horror all the way through, which confounds my doctors. But, yeah, I seem to be doing all right. So they're not particularly worried about it. They're just keeping an eye on it. There's no answer. Hopefully, we're due a big horror resurgence sometime soon. That would be nice. But I don't know. Or do you prefer your horror to stay underground? Because as soon as something resurges, it gets commodified and packaged. Punk did, grunge did. I mean, it happens. The turnover of trends is much quicker, it seems, in the music industry. But if there's a big breakout horror novel, they'll all come fucking running back. You just fucking know they will. It's like every fucking A&R man running to Seattle to try and sign any fucking Seattle band in the early 90s. They'll all come fucking running from the hills trying to sign. Oh well, what am I getting into now? Art versus commerce. They're bedfellows. Get over it, Andrew. So I've been rambling now for well over 15 minutes about there not being a horror section in my local Waterstones bookshop, and it pissed me off. And that is that. What do you think? How's the horror in your neck of the woods? Do you read horror? Because I know mainly I talk about horror movies on this channel. I've noticed that we recently got a subscription to Disney Plus, and they've got loads of horror content on there. They've got absolutely no horror category. I mean, the interface on Disney Plus is fucking shocking anyway. But you might as well, you root around and you're more likely to find a truffle than a movie that you want to watch, unless it's Star Wars or an MCU movie. But there's horror stuff on there, but you can find them under sci-fi and you can find them under thrillers, and then mysteriously not under any of those banners. But it might, if you find one and then look at suggestions based on that, they'll go, oh yeah, we've got a couple of other horror movies you might be interested in. Shh, don't tell anyone though. We're a family-friendly business, but you might be interested in The Hills Have Eyes 2, for fuck's sake.